Hey, I'm Nicole Ferraro, a contributing editor at Light Reading. Welcome to What's the Story, a short podcast where we take a step back from the most significant topics in telecom to tell you the latest news, how we got here, what it all means, and what to expect next. This week on the show, we're talking with Light Reading's Jeff Baumgartner about HBO's role in the streaming wars. Jeff recently wrote about Warner Media announcing it is phasing out HBO Go to clear up confusion around HBO's streaming services, particularly the recently launched HBO Max. Jeff's here to tell us what this means, why the success of HBO Max matters, and what's likely to happen next.
This podcast is sponsored by ServiceNow. Behind every great experience is a great workflow. ServiceNow delivers digital workflows that create great experiences and unlock productivity for communication service providers and their customers.
Jeff, thank you for being on the show.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me on here, Nicole.
My pleasure. So what's the story with HBO?
Well, if you had to boil it down, these days, the story with HBO kind of all centers around HBO Max, which is this supersized VOD service, subscription VOD service that launched May 27th, and it offers about double the amount of content of the legacy HBO service and kind of builds in some content from some other brands that are now part of Warner Media. So like Turner and Warner Brothers, and HBO Max is one of the initial big outcomes of AT&T's acquisition of Time Warner, and the notion, that by expanding the amount of content available on the service and hopefully use that to also broaden the appeal of the service, to maybe a bigger demographic that kind of goes beyond, well beyond what HBO has historically been able to get on its own. But the initial focus, has been, about converting existing HBO customers over to HBO Max with various pay TV operators that already have a sizable base of HBO subs. So I guess, but the risk, I guess, in doing that, I suppose, is that you might dilute the HBO brand a little bit.
Can you talk a little bit about what HBO's larger story in the streaming wars has been and why its role matters for the industry at large? And also, just based on what you've seen from HBO's prior steps in streaming, how do you see the launch of HBO Max going so far?
Yeah, the larger story is about, how some of these major studios and content suppliers are continuing to kind of shift to streaming and direct-to-consumer models. Even though distributing HBO Max through the pay TV operators is kind of the important thing early on, the writing on the wall is that, the pay TV subscriptions and big bundles are going to continue to erode. And you're going to see more consumers cutting the cord and kind of putting together their own packages. And with Warner Media, what they're trying to do is position HBO Max to become kind of one of the go-to, general entertainment streaming services, along with services like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video and Hulu's got an SVOD and Peacock, which is the streaming service that NBC Universal in mid-July, and then you asked me about, what's kind of going on, despite some of the confusion, which I know we'll talk about a little bit too, and so forth with HBO Max is, the app itself is not bad. And, generally it's fine. I like that it was made to be personalized and support individual profiles. And it's got a ton of content that I like. There's not really much there yet in terms of exclusive originals for HBO Max that's beyond what you get with the legacy HBO service. But, as a side note, I will say, I've been using HBO Max a lot more than I've used Disney Plus lately. They did the first season of The Mandalorian and I burned through that, and I haven't really gone on that service too much. If there's, kind of an early issue with HBO Max, it kind of feels a little kind of kludgy kind of right now because it's kind of living on its own, like in its silo sort of. Even for pay TV customers that take HBO already, they have access to HBO Max as well, but it's not really integrated with the pay TV experience. So I mean, that's kind of an early stumble with the way that they're kind of rebundling all the content under the HBO Max brand. And, I mean, that'll change. Comcast, for example, is doing, full integration of it with HBO Max with its X1 and Flex platforms. And at some point, you'll be able to search and access the entire HBO Max catalog in that environment. And it'll be the same with the other pay TV providers that have deals with HBO Max, but, we're just not there today.
Mm-hmm. So outside of, clearing up confusion around the name and improvements to the experience itself, what are some of the other big stories that you expect to come out around HBO Max? What are you going to be looking at in the near future?
Yeah, so I think that maybe the good news out of it is that the confusion about HBO Max should be relatively short and temporary. HBO Go, which was the streaming service that you get if you're an HBO customer and through a pay TV provider, I mean, that's going to be all phased out in late July, and converted to HBO Max. And then HBO Now, which is the standalone version of HBO that you can get without tying it to a pay TV service, that's going to get rebranded as HBO. So, but I think that consumers are still trying to grapple, with what this is, and it's going to take a little bit of time. But I think, like I said, I think it'll wear off as more of the legacy HBO customers are converted to the new offering, and it gets more fully integrated with the pay TV experience. And then the standalone HBO Now customers get moved. And I think the other big question I'll be thinking about is whether, the customers will stick, particularly those that are buying it as a standalone for $14.99 a month. I mean, that's kind of at the high end of the range, among the different subscription VOD services out there. And, if HBO Max has any trouble, kind of keeping the churn in check, keeping people from coming and going, I suppose it's possible that, Warner Media could have some trouble reaching the target. They're hoping to get like 75 to 90 million customers worldwide, including 50 million in the US here in the next 5 years. But the other thing I'll be keeping an eye on is, as we kind of head into next year, is an ad-supported version of HBO Max. It's supposed to cost obviously cost less than what they're doing today with the ad-free version. I also expect to see a deal with Dish and maybe Sling TV come together in the coming months, and HBO to get something done there. With the other thing we didn't really talk about were the other streaming platforms. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. HBO Max doesn't have any support yet for Roku and Amazon Fire TV, which were the two giant streaming platforms. So, but just generally, HBO Max has had some twists and turns and some bumps. I think it'll get straightened out eventually. They have some pretty good quality and breadth of the content, so I think that'll kind of help them out in the long term.
All right, awesome. So you're pretty optimistic, which is good to hear. And we'll be looking out for all of those stories from you going forward. So thank you so much for taking the time to dive into this with me, Jeff.
Of course, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much to Jeff Baumgartner for taking the time today, and thank you as well to our producer, Tian Fu, for making this episode, and thank you all for listening. If you like what you heard, please leave a review, share this episode with a colleague or friend, and subscribe to the Light Reading Podcast for more interviews and insights from the team. Thanks again for listening. That's the story for now. We'll be back again next week.
This podcast is sponsored by ServiceNow. Behind every great experience is a great workflow. ServiceNow delivers digital workflows that create great experiences and unlock productivity for communication service providers and their customers.